You know, familiar shenanigans, they really quack me up. I'm not apologizing for that pun. Do you know how much time went into editing this video? Today, we're going to talk about familiars in Pathfinder 2nd Edition on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who is over the moon that Paizo has toned down their familiar rules enough that I no longer have to fear my wife using her familiar to solo the avatar of a god of death. Yes, that's a real thing my wife did in D&D 3.5. Paizo, please watch the power creep. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today, we're going to take a look at familiars in Pathfinder 2nd Edition as part of my classic introduction series. Now in this series, what we do is we take a look at the options that are presented to player characters in TTRPGs, in this case Pathfinder 2e, and discuss what is available to players and what they can do with particular parts of the rules. Now typically, Classic Introductions discusses the classes that are available to players when they are building their characters, but there are some options that are available to characters that step outside of the realm of the base classes inside of the game, and one of those rule sets is familiars. Familiars are tiny magical animals that have bonded with your character in some fashion. They give your character access to some fun, unique, but typically non-combat abilities that can expand on what your character is capable of accomplishing. Familiars can be a lot of fun, and any longtime player of TTRPGs knows that familiar shenanigans is one of the highlights of almost any gaming table, but today I want to take a look at the rules for familiars in Pathfinder 2e. I want to talk about how to build a familiar, how to access a familiar, the different abilities that familiars can unlock for themselves or their masters, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what's known as specific familiars, which are unique familiar options available to particularly powerful characters inside of Pathfinder 2e. Now, allow me to say of this video that even though there is going to be a ton of information that is in this introduction to familiars, I couldn't possibly hit everything. Paizo has created a very flexible system for designing and building familiars, and really I think this system is ingenious. There are a lot of great things about Pathfinder 2e, and the system that they came up with for familiars is one of those things that I think gets overlooked when the game is talked about, but that really allows player creativity to be pushed to an incredible degree. So be aware, this video will overview a lot of different aspects related to familiars in Pathfinder 2e. You can definitely take this conversation farther. However, to get started on this conversation, let me go ahead and give you some references that you will want to be familiar with. The rules for familiars can be found on pages 217 to 218 of the Pathfinder 2e core rulebook, and it is also worthwhile to check out pages 147 to 148 of the Advanced Player's Guide that expands on the base familiar rules. Additionally, in the Advanced Player's Guide, you can find an important archetype that will be discussed in this video called the Familiar Master Archetype on page 174. Those references are probably the most important references you want to be familiar with. However, additional rules and options for familiars can be found in Lost Omens Pathfinder Society Guide, as well as Lost Omens Grand Bazaar, as well as Secrets of Magic, the Book of the Dead, and even some adventure paths for Pathfinder 2e. So, yeah, there's a lot of content out there. I will also throw a link to the rules for familiars on Archives of Nethys into the video description so that you have an easy place to start researching. But before we dive into all of the incredible options that Paizo gives us, those of you who are familiar, oh, the bad puns are not going to stop in this video. Those of you who are familiar with the YouTube call to action know that I would love it if you would like this video and share it. And if you're not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe. You can also check out my free Discord and my Patreon, both of which will be linked in the video description. And as always, the most important thing you can do is jump down into the comment section and let me know what your thoughts, insights, and observations are on this topic. I love to hear from you all, and talking to you is one of the best parts of this job. Alright, let's get started. Alright, so let's begin the discussion of familiars with a simple question. What is a familiar? And more importantly, what role does the familiar have inside of Pathfinder 2e? Familiars are classified as minions in Pathfinder 2e. For those of you who have seen the minion trait before, you know that any minion in 2e is a creature that you can give commands to during the course of play. Essentially, the master can spend one action to give their familiar 2 actions during a turn. All minions follow that basic setup. From there, Pathfinder 2e further clarifies that a familiar is a minion that is typically going to be some kind of tiny creature that is magically bonded to their master. Usually this creature is going to be an animal of some kind, although there are plenty of exceptions, from plants to imps to elementals to even your own shadow, but typically will be a tiny creature of some kind that you have imbued with magic and developed a kind of special bond with that you can then call on during the course of your adventures. And right here at the outset of our conversation about what a familiar is, we want to raise a very important question: what role does a familiar have inside of the game? And here I think it's very important to distinguish that a familiar is, in the vast majority of cases, is not intended to be a combat option for your player. Rather, familiars are intended to be more of utility support creatures that can help you in other situations inside of the game. Allow me to offer some comparisons to help you understand why I would say this. Let's start with the HP that a familiar has. All familiars are the same level as your character, and all familiars have 5 hit points per level. And no modifiers to that total unless you take the Tough Familiar ability, which will add 2 hit points per level. Now, if you were to go into the Animal Companion options in Pathfinder 2e, you would very quickly realize the beefiest familiar available is going to have less hit points than the weakest Animal Companion option available inside of the game. Familiars are not intended to be, nor should they serve as, hit point sponges for your character. Need more evidence? The rules for familiars actually explicitly state that familiars cannot perform strikes in the majority of circumstances. That's right, the game basically tells you, do not use your familiar to attack things. Go for the eyes, quackers! Basically, Paizo sends you all of the signals you need to know that familiars occupy a specifically utilitarian role inside of the game. But let's go ahead and talk about generating the statistics for familiars, because statistics for familiars are very much going to be based on the level of your main character. To figure out the AC and saving throws of your familiar, you use the AC and saving throw bonuses of your master, which are going to be based off of your master's level. It is important to note, however, familiars do not get any circumstance, status, or item bonuses for these particular stats. Familiars do have the ability to use perception, acrobatics, and stealth, and their modifier for those checks is equal to your character's level plus your spellcasting ability modifier. So, for example, a wizard's familiar would use the wizard's level plus their intelligence modifier for those particular roles. Now, familiars are not automatically trained in other skills inside of the game, but there are going to be abilities or options that will allow them to gain training in certain skills. In such a case, it would use the master's level plus 2, again plus whatever the spellcasting ability modifier for the master happens to be. When you choose a familiar, you do get to choose whether your familiar has a walking speed or a swim speed of 25 feet, but you do get one of those two options for free. and you can expand upon your familiar's movement options by taking other familiar abilities later on down the road. But with all of these statistical limitations in mind, where's the fun stuff come in? Well, that comes in the form of familiar and master abilities. Every day, at the start of the day, you get to select 2 abilities from a pretty stacked list of familiar abilities or master abilities that you want either your familiar or yourself to benefit from. Now, it is worth noting that there are going to be certain options inside of the game that will increase the number of abilities that you can select from. We'll talk about those more in the next section. And there is one notable restriction when it comes to picking familiar and master abilities, which is whatever your familiar happens to be, if that familiar would reasonably have that ability, you are required to pick that ability as one of your selections. And a simple example would be, if you had an owl familiar, then it would be expected for you to pick the flyer ability in order to give it a fly speed, because owls naturally have a fly speed. However, beyond requirements like that, you can really do anything you want to. And this is truly where familiars become such a fun aspect of the Pathfinder 2e rule set, because really, if you can dream it, you can make it with the Pathfinder 2e rules. You come up with the concept for your familiar, and then you just kind of give it the stuff that is appropriate to that concept. As a simple example, in the Pathfinder 2e core rulebook, they have an example of a winged kitten that might serve as a wizard's familiar. Some wizard somewhere magically bonded with a kitten and helped that kitten sprout wings, granting it the ability to fly that it otherwise wouldn't normally have. Are there winged kittens in the real world? No, but that doesn't stop your wizard from having one if that's what you'd like as your familiar. And here is the truly fun part. The familiar and master abilities that you get can be switched out every single day. Do you want your cat familiar to have wings and fly around one day? You can do that. The next day, would you like your cat to be able to talk to people? Guess what? That's an option. Every day you can go in and switch out which abilities you give your familiar to whatever is needed or important for that particular moment. And I have seen this come up in some very entertaining and creative ways at my own gaming table. I remember one incident where my players were trying to infiltrate an enemy fort, and it wasn't a time-sensitive mission. They had a while to accomplish this goal, and the sorcerer basically decided, hey, if we wait until tomorrow, I can switch out my familiar's abilities and give them these options that will allow them to go in and infiltrate the fort much easier. It was really cool, and it was a great creative moment inside of the game. Later on in this video, we'll discuss the different options for familiar and master abilities so that you can have kind of a menu of the different things you can do, but just realize this flexibility of designing whatever you want and giving it whatever you want, changing every day according to your whims. This is easily the best part of Pathfinder 2e Familiars, and I absolutely love this incredibly flexible and creative system that Paizo has given us. Alright, so familiars are fun options, and you get to be creative and really come up with whatever you want for your familiar, but let's go ahead and ask one of the most important questions. How can I get a familiar in Pathfinder 2nd Edition? How do I access them? Well, the answer here is really going to vary. But the typical way that you will access a familiar is going to be through class feats. Certain classes inside of Pathfinder 2nd Edition give you the option of bonding with a familiar and granting you all of those cool abilities that we previously mentioned. Now, some of the classes are pretty obvious. Classes like Wizard and Sorcerer and Witch from the Advanced Player's Guide can all potentially allow you to access a familiar at first level, and other classes, which might not be as obvious at first glance, could potentially give you familiars as well. Good examples of that include the Alchemist and the Leaf Order subclass for the Druid, both of which can also give you familiars, though in the case of the Leaf Order Druid, it does specifically note that you get a Leshy Plant Familiar from that class option. But what if you're not one of the specific classes that offers familiars as an option? Well, there is actually an archetype from the Advanced Player's Guide called the Familiar Master archetype that literally any character in the game can take at character level 2. There are no prerequisites to take this particular archetype. Just trade out a class feat at level 2, and any character you can imagine can potentially have a familiar to join them on their adventures. Alternatively, if the Familiar Master archetype is not really the main goal of your character, but you are interested in a familiar that might follow along with other concepts, another way that you could access a familiar would be through multi-class archetypes that include a class that has familiar as a feat option. So for example, if your character concept includes the multi-class dedication for Alchemist, you could, through that multi-class archetype, pick up the Alchemical Familiar as well. But as you can see, the most common way to access a familiar is going to be through class feats, either through the direct feats that the class gives you, or through the Familiar Master archetype feats that you can trade out for your regular class feats. However, that rule is not universal in its application. There are other options inside of the game that can give you familiars in other ways. A good example of this is the Animal Accomplice Ancestry feat for gnomes, which gives your gnome character access to an animal familiar, in that case, typically a burrowing familiar of some kind. If I tried to go into every single possible mode of access for a familiar, honestly this video would get way too long way too quickly. So when you're looking at options in Pathfinder 2e, keep your eyes open. You may stumble across a unique or interesting way to access a familiar that's not from one of the main routes of access, which is through class features or class feats. Now before we leave the subject of accessing familiars, there are a few things that I want to note for players who really want to go all in on having a cool familiar. Some people may want to have a familiar, but they're not planning on investing very heavily in that part of their character, and if so, a single class feat or maybe 2 class feats could easily cover everything that you want to do. But some people want to go off the wall crazy, go big or go home. They want to take as many abilities as they can, they want to have as many options as possible, and in that case, there are certain paths that will probably be more appealing to you if you're really trying to dig into all that a familiar can do. From a class feat or feature perspective, the Witch, the Improved Familiar Attunement Thesis Wizard, or the Familiar Master archetype are probably going to be the 3 most potent ways of really accessing everything that you can do with a familiar. The Witch gets a familiar without even using a single class feat. That's pretty powerful. And on top of that, Witch familiars don't start with 2 abilities, they start with 3. As they level up, they also get 3 bonus abilities, again without investing any class features whatsoever. Now most wizards who take the familiar feat, they're going to start with the base 2 familiar abilities, but if you have the Improved Familiar Attunement Thesis for a wizard, it's going to mirror the progression that I just discussed for the Witch's familiar, starting with a base of 3 abilities and naturally gaining 3 bonus abilities without investing any more class feats in what your familiar can do. So the Witch, or that particular subclass of the wizard, are probably going to be the most direct routes to access extra familiar abilities, but the Familiar Master archetype can also pretty easily help you gain a lot of extra options in this particular aspect of your character. Now another thing to keep in mind when it comes to familiars is the way that you access a familiar is often going to vary what your familiar can do, or maybe what abilities your familiar can potentially access. So again, trying to go through every single option that is unlocked through every single path that you can gain a familiar, way beyond the scope of this video, but there are 3 particular feats that I think are worth keeping your eye out for if you really want to dig in on having a very unique and creative familiar for your character. These feats are Enhanced Familiar, Improved Familiar, and Incredible Familiar. Enhanced Familiar will take you from a base 2 familiar abilities to a base of 4 familiar abilities once you take this particular feat. By the way, if you are a witch or an improved familiar attunement wizard, that would stack with any bonus abilities, meaning you would have a base of at least 5. And yes, that would continue to increase with any other bonuses throughout your character progression. The next feat that is worth discussing is called Improved Familiar, and what that's going to do is it's actually going to lower the investment cost of what's known as specific familiars. Now, specific familiars is a concept that is introduced in the Advanced Player's Guide, and we're going to talk about those in more depth later in this video. For now, it's worth noting that if you want to take a specific familiar, essentially what you have to do is you have to invest a certain number of familiar abilities in order to access a given specific familiar. So for example, a certain specific familiar might require you to spend 4 selections before you could even take it. The Improved Familiar feat will lower that cost by 2. So if a specific familiar normally required you to invest 4 picks, you could instead invest only 2 in order to gain that familiar ability, freeing up the rest of your abilities to invest however you see fit. And then there is Incredible Familiar, which increases the base number of abilities for your familiar up to a total of 6. And again, that is the base number before any modifiers from your class, subclass, or whatever access route you have to getting your familiar. High-level witches, wizards, and familiar masters could be running around with effectively 10, maybe even 12 different familiar abilities for their companion. Yes, you can get some pretty absurd combinations going on by stacking these features together. Okay, now that we understand what a familiar is and how to access a familiar, now it is time to move into what is truly the playground of options when it comes to the familiar, and that is familiar and master abilities. Again, every day you get to pick at least 2, maybe more, abilities from a pretty stacked list of basically bonus options that either your familiar or you get to benefit from. Now, I should note there are some restrictions when it comes to choosing abilities. Earlier, we talked about the requirement that you must choose abilities that would correspond to whatever is appropriate to the familiar concept that you have. And we talked about if you have a flying familiar, you need to spend one of your options on the flyer ability. That's pretty straightforward. You will find other requirements as well when you start reading through the list. Some familiar or master abilities may require you to be a certain level. Other abilities may require you to pick kind of a chain of abilities. You must have the first ability before you can pick the second, that kind of thing. So be aware that when you are choosing familiar and master abilities, that there may be certain requirements that you have to follow in addition to the base ones we discussed earlier. But let's fly through a ton of abilities really fast. We'll start with the familiar abilities first. The first one is Accompanist, which I hope I said correctly, and which also allows your familiar to assist you when you make performance checks. The next one is Ambassador, which gives your familiar a reaction that they can use to aid your character when you make diplomacy checks. The Amphibious ability annoys me a little bit. It gives your familiar a swim speed of 25 feet if they already didn't have a swim speed, but the ability doesn't actually make your familiar amphibious like if it was a frog. Talk to your GM, because I would honestly rule that if they have the amphibious ability, they should be able to breathe air and water. Kinda wish Paizo done better on that naming convention. The Burrower ability gives your familiar a burrow speed of 5 feet, which they can use to create tiny holes. And the Climber ability gives your familiar a climb speed of 25 feet. The Damage Avoidance ability allows you to pick one type of saving throw, and anytime your familiar rolls a success on that type of saving throw, they take no damage instead of half damage. However, they don't gain any other benefits that might be associated with abilities like Evasion. Dark Eater is an option that is associated with Shadow Magic from the book Secrets of Magic. This allows a Shadow familiar or other familiar associated with a Shadow caster to recover hit points by spending time in the dark. And the dark vision ability is pretty self-explanatory. It gives your familiar dark vision. Next up, you have the fast movement ability, which can increase any movement speed that your familiar has from 25 feet to 40 feet. Either the base speed that any familiar gets, or another speed that you have been given through a previous familiar ability. And speaking of movement abilities, the flyer ability gives your familiar a 25-foot fly speed. The next option is called Focused Rejuvenation, and when you use the refocus activity, it allows your familiar to recover a number of hit points equal to your level. Next up is the familiar ability Gills, which gives your familiar the ability to breathe water as well as air, but like I said back on Amphibious, I personally would just wrap this ability in with the Amphibious ability, but rules as written, Amphibious gives your familiar the swim speed, Gills gives them the ability to breathe water, and they are two separate abilities. Paizo, yes, this naming convention bugs me. The next three options are options that stack with one another, and that is Resistance, Greater Resistance, and Major Resistance. With all of these abilities, you get to pick a particular type of energy and gain a resistance to damage of that type. The Resistance ability allows you to pick an energy type and give your familiar resistance to that damage equal to 1/2 your level. Greater Resistance increases the energy resistance to 3 plus 1/2 your level, and Major Resistance improves the energy resistance to your full level. The Independent ability allows you to work around the minion aspect of a familiar a bit, and even if you don't give your familiar a command, your familiar will still get a single action every turn that they can use, but it does note with the Independent ability that it's up to your game master whether your familiar is doing exactly what you want it to do or not. Anyone who has ever owned a cat knows exactly how real that is. The Kin Speech ability has a requirement that you must be at least 6th level and gives your familiar the ability to speak with creatures of its kind. So, for example, if you had a cat familiar, it could speak with other cats. The next ability is called Lab Assistant and is intended specifically for alchemists that have a familiar. It gives the alchemist familiar the ability to use the alchemist Quick Alchemy ability. Now, obviously, the master needs Quick Alchemy, and the familiar must occupy the master's space in order to use this ability, but so long as the familiar meets those requirements and has the Manual Dexterity ability, this can allow the alchemist familiar to mix some bombs or elixirs for their master while the master is otherwise occupied. Speaking of Manual Dexterity, this gives the familiar the ability to perform actions that have the Manipulate trait using up to 2 of its limbs. The next option is particularly interesting in my mind. It's called Master's Form. Now, this requires your familiar to have both Manual Dexterity and Speech, but if you do, your familiar gains the ability to turn into a humanoid form that resembles whatever ancestry you have as the creature's master. So if you were human, your familiar could turn into a humanoid form and potentially perform tasks in that form. However, it is worth noting that a familiar who takes such a form still maintains certain cosmetic elements that indicates that they are not quite a normal member of that ancestry. So for example, if a serpent familiar were to use Master's Form, they still might maintain their serpent's tongue while they talked. Seriously, this one has some messed up implications, and I could see this being a lot of fun in play. For those of you who are considering playing an Eldritch Trickster Rogue, you might want to consider the Partner in Crime familiar ability, which gives your familiar a reaction that they can use to aid you on deception or thievery checks. Yes, that's right, 2 different skill checks that they can potentially aid you on. Another option is the Plant Form ability, which is only available to familiars that have the plant subtype, but allow them to gain the benefits of the Tree Shape spell. Poison Reservoir is a special option only available if you took the Homunculus specific familiar, but it allows your Homunculus to share their injury poison with you and potentially poison your weapons. Up next, you have the Scent option, which will give your familiar an imprecise sense of scent with a range of 30 feet. Second Opinion gives your familiar a special reaction that they can use to aid you on any recall knowledge check. And much like the Partner in Crime ability, I love the incredible flexibility associated with so many potential use cases there. There is also the Shadow Step ability, which is only available if you are 7th level and have the Shadowcaster archetype, but it gives your familiar the Shadow Step ability, allowing them to teleport 30 feet, as long as they are teleporting through shadows. Skilled is an option that allows your familiar to pick a particular skill and gain a bonus on checks with that skill equal to your level plus your spellcasting modifier, rather than just your level. And the Snoop ability allows your familiar to spend a reaction to aid you on diplomacy checks to gather information. Essentially, this turns your familiar into a miniature spy. Speech is relatively straightforward. It gives your familiar the ability to speak a language that you know. And one of the fun late game options for familiars is spellcasting. Pick a spell that is in your spell repertoire or that is one of the spells that you can prepare, and give your familiar the ability to cast that spell once per day. Now, there is a restriction here. Your familiar can only cast a spell that is 5 levels lower than the highest level spell that you can cast. So, if you can cast 6 level spells, this would give your familiar the ability to cast a 1st level spell. But just be aware, if you can cast 8th level spells, yes, your familiar can cast Fireball once per day using this option. Your familiar uses your spell attack and spell save DCs as appropriate when they cast this spell. The next familiar ability is called Threat Display, and is designed to allow your familiar to assist you when you attempt to demoralize a creature with the Intimidation skill. Basically, it allows your familiar to make very dramatic and threatening displays while you're attempting the Intimidation check, and allows you to remove any language-based penalties that might apply to that Intimidation check. Your familiar can also take the Tool Bearer ability, which allows them to carry around a set of tools, and as long as your familiar is next to you, you can access and stow tools as part of the action to perform skill checks that would use those tools. Touch Telepathy is an ability that allows you to communicate telepathically with your familiar via touch, and if your familiar also has the Speech ability, they can communicate telepathically via a touch with any creature that they share a language with. Tough is a pretty straightforward ability for your familiar, granting your familiar an additional 2 hit points per level. Tremor Sense is an ability that gives your familiar an imprecise sense of, well, tremor sense with a range of 30 feet. And Wave Sense is essentially the same thing, but it applies to water. Valet is a little bit of a weird ability that you can give your familiar that basically allows you to command your familiar to deliver items at a certain point in time, essentially allowing them to pass the item to you at whatever point would be appropriate. The rules are a little more complicated than that, but if you're interested in this ability, you can read up on it. And those are all of the familiar abilities, so let's move on to the master abilities. Master abilities are options that you can take that apply to you as the master. Now, really quick, I would like to note there is a feat with the Familiar Master archetype called Familiar Mascot, which allows you to give one of your master abilities to any creature in your party, not just yourself. So there are ways to take these abilities that are usable for you and actually give them to other members of your group. But let's dig into the master abilities. The first ability is called Cantrip Connection, and basically what this does is, through your familiar, you gain the ability to access or prepare an additional cantrip every day. For Alchemist, there is the Extra Reagents ability, which causes your familiar to grant you an additional batch of infused reagents every day. The Familiar Focus ability allows your familiar, once a day, to spend 2 actions with the Concentrate trait and restore 1 focus point to you, their master. Innate Surge allows your familiar to power spellcasting that you get from your ancestry rather than your class, so if you have a spell that you access because of your ancestry, such as through an ancestry feat, once per day your familiar can allow you to recast that spell even if it's already been expended. Lifelink is a special ability that allows you as the master to protect your familiar. If your familiar would take enough damage to drop to 0 hit points, as a reaction, you can instead take the damage for your familiar, though your familiar will suffer any other effects associated with the source of that damage. You can also take the Recall Familiar ability, which allows you, once per day as a 3-action activity, to call your familiar back to your side. Recall Familiar has the concentration and teleportation traits and has a maximum range of 1 mile. Restorative Familiar is an ability that allows your familiar to actually protect you a little bit. Once per day is a 2-action activity. Your familiar can spend some of its animating energy and provide some healing to you. The next master ability is a classic, and that is Share Senses. Once every 10 minutes, you can spend an action to concentrate and project your senses into your familiar, allowing you to perceive through your familiar and wherever they happen to be. Share Senses lasts for up to 1 minute, but can be used repeatedly throughout the day. The Spell Battery Master Familiar basically gives you access to more spells that you gain because of your connection with your familiar. You gain an additional spell of any spell level up to 3 spell levels below the maximum level of spell that you can cast. So, for example, if you can cast 4th level spells, you could gain an additional 1st level spell slot every day. Spell Delivery is another classic master ability. For this one, you can designate your familiar to be the person who delivers a touch spell. So, if the familiar is in your space, you can cast your spell like normal, but rather than unleashing it yourself, you transfer the spell to your familiar, who then has its 2 actions as your minion to move towards the target and touch them, thus delivering the spell. It is worth noting that if you use your familiar this way, they must touch the target that round, or the spell will have no effect. And the final master ability is called Tattoo Transformation, which allows you to turn your familiar into a stylized tattoo that is kept somewhere on your body. Even though it is a tattoo on your body, your familiar is still a separate creature that must be targeted separately in order to be affected, and while creatures can attempt a seek check in order to figure out that the tattoo is actually your familiar, the rules do note that very few creatures would ever be inclined to do so. This makes Tattoo Transformation a very effective way of hiding your familiar and keeping it safe from creatures that might try to harm it. And that is all of the different options that you get to mix or match when designing the familiar that you want to use with your character. However, you can go a little bit deeper, and that is with specific familiars. Now, as of the recording of this video, Paizo has given us 17 different specific familiars across several different products, such as the Advanced Player's Guide, the Pathfinder Society Guide, the Book of the Dead, and even in some adventure paths. The essential idea, as mentioned earlier, is this. The Familiar's Master must spend a certain number of ability picks on certain preset abilities, but if you spend those picks, you get access to a specific creature. And as a result of access to that specific creature, you then get 1 or more special abilities on top of what you have already purchased. Now, I don't want to go through all 17 options that currently exist, especially since this is clearly one of the areas where Paizo is going to be releasing more content as more books come out, but what I will do is I will talk about one sample from the Advanced Player's Guide to kind of let you know how this works, and that is with the Fairy Dragon. The Fairy Dragon is a tiny familiar that, as per its name, comes with the dragon type. In order to take the Fairy Dragon, you're going to need to spend a minimum of 6 ability picks to gain this specific familiar. Those ability picks are Amphibious, Dark Vision, Flyer, Manual Dexterity, Speech, and Touch Telepathy. If you spend 6 of your familiar ability picks on these abilities, then you can take the Fairy Dragon as your specific familiar, and as the bonus for doing this, you gain access to the Fairy Dragon's Euphoric Breath Weapon special ability, which your familiar can then use as normal. Pretty much any specific familiar is going to follow this template. Now, the number of required abilities is going to vary from specific familiar to specific familiar, and there is a ton of variety here. There's a lot of really cool ones in Book of the Dead. Paizo had some fun with like talking skulls and crawling hands, and if you want to have some creepy fun options, you should definitely check those out. But again, each specific familiar is going to have a certain number of abilities that you have to pick, but it is then going to grant some special abilities if you meet those prerequisites. It is worth noting that if you have more ability picks than is necessary, you can assign those ability picks however you might choose. So if you had access to 8 familiar abilities and you wanted to take the Fairy Dragon Familiar, you would spend 6 to access the Fairy Dragon, and then you would have 2 remaining that you could use however you saw fit. There is one other type of specific familiar that I think is worth pointing out, and that is the Shadow Familiar from Secrets of Magic. Essentially, the idea behind the Shadow Familiar is that you as the master have animated your own shadow and use it as your familiar. This is creepy and cool and amazing, and you may remember me mentioning a few Shadowcaster specific familiar abilities. Those are abilities that are typically only available to shadow magic users. This is a great specific familiar option, and definitely one that's worth checking out if you enjoy creepier ideas. It is worth noting that the Shadowcaster Shadow Magic familiar options, Secrets of Magic talks about that these might also be available to things like Shadow Dancers or Clerics with the Darkness domain. That's going to be very much subject to Game Master approval, and might require your Game Master to allow access to feats that are not normally part of that class's repertoire. For example, Shadow Dancers normally can't take familiars, but your Game Master might say that your Shadow Dancer could take that feat if they were so inclined. It takes a little bit of extra work, but it's so creepy and fun, it's definitely worth it if you're inclined to go that direction. But that brings us to the end of what I want to talk about in this video. Again, I have not discussed everything that can potentially go into having and using familiars. There are items, there are spells, there are all kinds of fun options that are packed into different nooks and crannies of the Pathfinder 2e system, but I think this is a good overview of what you can expect if you'd like to have a familiar for your character in Pathfinder 2e. But let me turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about familiars in Pathfinder 2e? Do you enjoy this kind of create your own model that Paizo has created? And what are some of the coolest familiars that you have seen at your gaming table? What abilities do you enjoy? And do you think that there are abilities that Paizo should offer us in the future? Dive into the comments section down below and let me know your thoughts. And don't forget, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.